So today I saw something that was talking about how India has between 80 to 90% of its citizens are D deficient, that's vitamin D deficient. And you know that I've mentioned this before on this channel because it's so important, vitamin D, just in general, and that most people today are vitamin D deficient, whether that's because we're leading more of an indoor life or whether it's because we have our skin covered up more, or whether we have high levels of melanin in our skin, which is the case with India. There's a lot of citizens in India who have high levels of melanin in their skin, and the same goes for the United States. A lot of black people are more susceptible to COVID because of the low vitamin D that they have in their body. Their serum vitamin D levels are very low, and that means that they're not only susceptible, very susceptible to high morbidity from COVID, but they're also they're susceptible to a range of very serious illnesses, including diabetes type 2, and that is fairly common in the U.S. with black people, and it's common in general because there's so much animal product consumption, and apparently studies have shown that animal fat leads to insulin resistance in the muscle. So that's another reason for that's another main reason for diabetes type 2. If one has low vitamin D in their system, then you're susceptible to a whole range, including cancer, a whole range of serious illnesses. So anyway, but I wanted to get back to India. I mean, India has about 1 billion people there, and they've been doing very well with their COVID response, meaning they haven't had a lot of COVID infected cases until just recently, when the variant, which is highly contagious, that has come from, I don't know if it's the UK variant, but apparently that is now the problem, and it absolutely skyrocketed the COVID cases in India, and apparently in New Delhi, the hospitals are running out of oxygen, and this is a real problem for Palestinians too in Israel. And I've mentioned that before in another video, that there's a case of medical apartheid in Israel where they're vaccinating Israelis and not vaccinating Palestinians. And there's all sorts of there's many problems with that whole issue, and this is one of them, which is it's basically assisting the ongoing genocide of Palestinians in their occupied territories and in Gaza. So the oxygen is they need a certain amount of oxygen every day, and they only have half of that in Palestinians anyway. But back to India and New Delhi, they're running out of oxygen. The crematoriums are completely full because there's a lot of deaths now from COVID. And having been to India and having actually been in a Western hospital in India, East West Hospital in New Delhi, I don't know if that still exists, but in the late 90s I had to go there. I got a upper respiratory tract infection, which really was bad in my sinuses, and I won't go into the details because I had a lot of fluid in my head, and I ended up basically feeling very ill. I was vomiting as well associated with that. I didn't really get any gastro issues. It was just this terrible flu that I got. And that hospital actually was pretty good. But it wasn't a really modern hospital, but the staff were good, and I got treated well, and after 3 days I was feeling much better. But the problem is that there are a lot of hospitals that aren't like that. You can go to, there's another hospital I saw, I remember I think it was in Himachal Pradesh, where, there was piles of, there were piles of scraps out the front of the hospital, and it was really, really basic. And I can imagine that hospitals like that would probably easily become inundated, and probably the care would not be so great. Now, it's a long time ago since I've been to India, like that was 21 years ago, 22 years now ago, so things may have changed a lot, but it really depends on how much the government, and since it's run by Modi, and he is a neoconservative, well, some would say fascist, that he's probably not putting a whole lot of effort into anything for the people. So apparently there has been a lack of preparation for even it's been ongoing for the last year or so in India, and there's been a lack of preparation for this recent surge. Hospitals running out of oxygen, that's really, really serious, and they basically now in Delhi, I think, basically saying that they can't fit anybody else in. Now, can you imagine if you were really ill, or your mother or your friend was really ill, and they desperately needed to go to hospital, and they desperately needed oxygen, and you weren't able to get in? I mean, it would just be appalling to see somebody gasping for air and possibly either dying of, there's always these complications of clotting, which cause strokes and kidney failure and all kinds of things. That would be something that could happen right before your eyes, or or just the visuals of somebody choking to death because they can't, from air hunger, they can't get enough oxygen. That must be appalling. So I really have good thoughts for India in this really, really difficult time. I have good thoughts for Palestinians. I hope that if anybody knows of a group that, a charity that is a reliable charity that is collecting money for oxygen cylinders for Palestinians, please put that in the comment section of this video, because I'd really like to know what that is and pass that information on, because they're not going to really get any help from the Israeli government, the Palestinians, and they desperately need oxygen there at the moment for the COVID, the influx and the increase of COVID. And in India, as I said, the crematoriums are, and these are open crematoriums too, so it must be really crazy that, they're like big sort of like parking lots really, with some are covered and others are just out in the open. And I mean, cremations are very common, of course, in India, but they've got, hundreds of bodies on top of, piles of wood, and they do it like that, and they're running out of space in crematoriums, which is kind of amazing, really. Considering that it's sort of out in the open, it's not some sort of industrialized thing. What I wanted to show you was just a little excerpt from a doctor of nursing that I saw today, and he was talking about vitamin D deficiency and what that can lead to. It's only about 2 minutes long, or even a minute long. It's not very long at all.
Consequences of vitamin D. Rickets, of course, we know about. The bendy bones in children. Muscle strength reduction. Lack of vitamin D reduces muscle strength reduction. But lack of vitamin D is also associated with autoimmune disease, where the immune system attacks the body's own tissues. Cardiovascular disease, psychological depression, which can lead to suicide. Parkinson's disease, cancers, infections, tuberculosis, which of course is a chronic infection. It's associated with obesity and diabetes mellitus type 2. So all of these things are associated with and may well be caused by lack of vitamin D.
And I'll bring your attention to a video that is by a doctor about vitamin D and how important it is in relation to COVID.
Okay, so let's take a look at the evidence. We'll sort of start out with observational studies, and we'll end up with randomized prospective controlled trials. So we knew very early on, this is a paper that was published back in 1985, looking at vitamin D and age. And what we found was that as you get older, the ability for your skin to produce vitamin D3 drops by more than twofold as you get up into the 70s and the 80s. The other thing that we knew from a long time ago, back in 2012, is that there is a difference in terms of vitamin D and race or skin color. Here you can see the graph looking at different levels of vitamin D. Here's less than 10, here's 11 to 20, 21 to 30, and greater than 30. And these bars simply represent white is white, black is black, and the gray are Mexican Americans. This is a study that was done in the United States. And what you can see here in this observational study, at greater than 30, which would be considered to be adequate, the majority of that population is white. As we go down below 20 in this range, that the people that make up the majority of this population are disproportionately darker skinned people. So this is certainly a public health issue that needs to be addressed. Another thing that we've known about for some time, for about 20 years at least, is vitamin D and BMI. Of course, vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin. And as such, it's going to be stored in the fat. And so if you have a lot of adipose tissue or fat, then you're going to have a larger capacity to hold vitamin D, which means you're going to have less soluble vitamin D to be used. This is a direct quote from this study. Because humans obtain most of their vitamin D requirement from exposure to sunlight, the greater than 50% decreased bioavailability of cutaneously synthesized vitamin D in the obese subjects could account for the consistent observation by us and others that obesity is associated with vitamin D deficiency. Oral vitamin D should be able to correct the vitamin D deficiency associated with obesity, but larger than usual doses may be required for very obese patients. Okay, so let's look at the evidence of vitamin D insufficiency and deficiency in mortality from studies that were done not on COVID, but prior to COVID, but still looking at respiratory diseases. So here's an interesting study that was done looking at about 10,000 patients in Germany with 50 to 70-year-olds. It was prospective, so that's definitely a positive for this study, but it was an observational study, so they weren't intervening here. And look at the years for follow-up, 15-year follow-up in these patients. So let's take a look and see what they did. They measured these patients in Germany and looked at their vitamin D levels. And you can see that here on the x-axis. So again, this is in nanomoles per liter. So you have to divide by 2.5 to get nanograms per milliliter. And generally, they made some cutoffs here. This was at 30, and this here was at 50. And so they said, if you're greater than 50, then that's good. If you're in the middle portion, that's 30 to 50 nanomoles per liter, then that's sort of in the middle. And then here you've got less than 30. That's what they figured as deficient. And then they just followed them. They just watched them and they see what they did. And they looked at the death certificates after 15 years in these patients that started to die, and they wanted to see what was it that they died from. And this is what they found. Those people that had vitamin D levels of greater than 50 had a better survival in terms of respiratory mortality than those that had less than 30. And of course, the 30 to 50 were somewhere in the middle. But definitely statistically significant in terms of vitamin D levels predicting respiratory mortality. In fact, from the study, they said statistically, after adjustment for sex, age, and season of blood draw, school education, smoking, BMI, physical activity, and fish consumption, 41% of the variability in respiratory mortality during this 15-year follow-up period was independently associated with 25 hydroxy vitamin D levels less than 50. That showed that in autopsies in patients with COVID-19 compared to those who did not have COVID-19, there was a 9-fold increase in blood clots in the lung tissue. So that is something that is very unique. And then when we started to look at the epidemiology of patients with COVID-19, again, more eyebrows being raised. Here's a pretty powerful study looking at 17 million patients, specifically looking at about 10,000 COVID-19 deaths. And what did we see? We see something really interesting. If you look here at the age group, this is nothing new. We know this, that those who are higher in age are more likely to die from COVID-19. And you can see here, the higher in age we go, the more risk there is in that category. We can see that male gender has some risk as well. Here we see with obesity that as the obesity level goes up, the risk starts to go up as well. And here we see again with ethnicity, as we start to compare to Caucasian or white, that all of these darker skinned races have increased risk for death in COVID-19. And if you will remember, these are exactly the same three things that we saw put people at risk for vitamin D deficiency, both elderly age, increased obesity, and darker skin color. And so one has to wonder now, is this coincidental? Or is this something else that we need to investigate? Is it possible that vitamin D may have a role in the mortality and morbidity of COVID-19?
Vitamin D in the prevention of coronavirus disease, 2019 infection, and mortality. So this study looked at 20 European countries.
The average vitamin D levels, looked at COVID cases, and also COVID mortality. And this, of course, was as of April of 2020. So they looked at these 20 different countries. And what they found was an inverse relationship with this R and P value that showed that the higher the vitamin D levels of that country, the lower the COVID-19 cases per million population. You can see there a fairly straight line going through this plot. So once again, these are nanomoles per liter, so you need to divide by 2.5 to get nanograms per deciliter. Now, this is for cases. What about mortality? Well, they did the same thing for mortality, and it was very, very similar. So again, mean vitamin D levels that were very high had almost 0% mortality, whereas those that were very low, like around 40 to 50 in this situation, had a higher mean COVID-19 mortality per 1 million population.
Because if you have low vitamin D levels, which I've said a lot of people do, because I don't know the whole reasons why. I've mentioned a few of them, but there's something else going on there because it's a worldwide deficiency, and because of that, a lot of people are susceptible to COVID, and particularly if you are black or brown and you have high melanin levels in your skin. So, and that of course prevents vitamin D production in your body, and sunlight isn't enough. So vitamin D supplementation is really important, and because I'm vegan, I take vegan vitamin D3. And that does a fine job. I've had my D levels tested. But there was a point about 12 years ago how long ago was it? There was a point about, in 2010 where I had incredibly low levels of vitamin D. And I think that because I'm not really into being out in hot sun. I'm not a fan of the heat. So in Queensland, I wasn't going out a whole lot in the hot sun, and I think that was probably partially my reasons for having low vitamin D. But then I have friends who have gotten plenty of D, and plenty of sun, and they've had dangerously low vitamin D levels. So, it doesn't even rely on how much sun you get. It's really something else. So that's why it's so important for us to supplement. And I take in winter, I take probably 2,500 units of vitamin D, vegan vitamin D3 a day. And in summer, probably 1,000 units of vitamin D. And it, even older people, it helps with falls and stuff like that. There's so many benefits to it. So I hope that people will consider supplementing with vegan vitamin D because the vitamin D that you get is from sheep, and we don't need to use animals for vitamin D or any other reason really. We just don't, and we should do our best and our best, what is humanly possible, to avoid using animals because they're sentient. And if we actually focused on not using animals and actually applied science, for example, to not torturing and killing animals for these experiments, we really basically only use animals because we can. We do so because they're considered property legally, and therefore why not? But really we need to stop using animals, period, and that includes not only for food, clothing, entertainment, but for other reasons. So that's my little vegan talk there, and I hope I made sense there. And so anyway, with India, I hope that I wanted to do this video because I'm hoping that if it gets any exposure at all, which my videos usually don't, but if it does, and they see the headline that 80 to 90% of Indians are D deficient, they really need to supplement with vitamin D, then I hope that somebody sees that, and maybe it helps sort of save some lives, really, because it will be beneficial to help with not getting the extreme symptoms of COVID. It won't stop you from getting COVID, but it will certainly ameliorate or mitigate the symptoms and the morbidity rate, but also all those other diseases that I mentioned, diabetes and calcium deficiency and all those kind of things, cancer. There's a whole host of different diseases. So I'll see if I can pick some excerpts from that video from that doctor, and I'll also show you this Doctor of Nursing's 1-minute video. And thanks so much for watching. My name's Trish Roberts. You're watching Faint Signals from Vega. Till next time. Bye for now.